Welcome back to another True Crime Saturday. I do apologize for being about half an hour late. It does happen. Lots of things occurring in the background, but besides the point, enough excuses on my part. We're going to dig right into this pretty gruesome, kind of gut-wrenching homicide case. Took place over in Villisca, Iowa. In 1912, June 9th to 10th, depending on the details, which ones you're following. In 1912, a family of 6 and their 2 guests were murdered inside their home as they slept. The problem with this case is the fact that there was a lot of crime scene contamination. So a lot of the evidence was touched by much of the public that was onlooking. And this was anywhere between, I would say, give or take about 8 a.m. Up until probably noonish, maybe 2 o'clock or so. I believe is when this is going to be, when the crime scene was actually fully contaminated. But the bodies were discovered about 7 o'clock in the morning or so, a little bit past. And that was by one of the victim's fathers, or not fathers, but brothers. And he only discovered it because he had a key. Now, this is the interesting part, because you also have to look at that, of course, as kind of a piece of evidence, almost. Okay, now this is a family that, granted, during those times would have been common for people to leave their doors unlocked. I mean, especially in a small town, I'd argue yes. So somebody coming into the home, could that have occurred? Yes, absolutely. I think it would have been quite easy. But here's the thing. The killers attacked in the middle of the night, and the doors were locked when the neighbor had tried to go in. Basically, 7 o'clock in the morning, noticed, oh, hey, none of the family's out doing chores. Let's go check up on them. Knocked on the door. Nobody was available. Nobody responded, period. So that neighbor went and let the chickens loose. I believe is what it was, the chickens. Yeah, once it was the chickens. And basically contacted Josiah Moore, which is the head of the household, the head male of the household, I should say. Contacted his brother, and his brother came and knocked, yelled for him, no response, and then just used a spare key to get in. So whoever had done this had locked the door. They would have had to have had a key. Now, here's the thing. There wasn't a whole lot of evidence collection. It was very, very good evidence collection, right? Because, end of the day, how many keys would that family have had? Okay, now there's no sign that anybody checked on any of the details like that. So that's already, there's clue number 1, all right? Before we even get into the board, we need to note that there was no keys that really accounted for. We don't know who had access. We know that at least it would have been, arguably, Josiah Moore and his wife, Sarah Moore. But as for the kids, you had 4 of the kids there out of the 6 kids that were total in the house that were found murdered. There's Herman, age 12, Catherine, age 11, Boyd, 7, Paul, 5. And then, of course, there was the 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina. I'm not sure which pronunciation would be correct, but I'm going to go with Ina for this sake, who were 12 and 8. But they were guests. They were just there for a sleepover with Catherine. So the question is, who all had keys? And I would definitely say Josiah and Sarah. They would have been at least 2 keys right there. But it could also be assumed possibly Herman and Catherine, possibly Boyd. I couldn't see giving a key to a 5-year-old, but hey, maybe that's the case. There could have been upwards towards about a total of 6 keys, right? So the 4 children and then the 2 heads of household. But nobody, accounted for it. There's kind of a problem there. All right. So let's start getting right into the details of evidence when it comes to this case, to really take a look at what exactly we're working with here. And you're going to be, I think you guys are going to be shocked at really what's going on here, especially during these times. This wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't really common, right? Nowadays, this ends up being more of a kind of a common trope, but we're going to go over the details on this right now. All right, so first up, the whole timeline I want to go over very, very closely, right? So we have the Moores and the 2 Stillinger girls attended a Children's Day service at the Villisca Presbyterian Church, which is roughly 2 blocks away from their residence. So you can see it circled on the map right there. It's not very far, right? Well, the Moores and their guests left the church service around 9:30 or so and arrived home between, give or take, 9:45 and about 10 o'clock p.m. Okay, now it's assumed that everyone basically went to bed shortly after they arrived home, so give or take about 10 o'clock. This is going to take time for people to fall asleep. Now, you look at it, there's some people maybe very hard day at work. Well, you got to look at a few things here, right? Their typical day, according to Peckham, they would have been up early, somewhere probably between, give or take, 5 or 6, possibly, upwards towards about 6:30 maybe. So their days were starting really early. So you got, all your chores throughout the day. This is a typical family here, just living in a small town. So they had tons and tons of chores they were doing to go and get ready for the day. Of course, looking at the days and all this kind of stuff. They were at a church service. I don't have the exact day off the top of my head. I should, of course, but my apologies on that. But they would have had chores regardless of the day. Now, the fact remains here. So they had animals they had to take care of. So they had to be up early, probably. But I would argue their day probably started about 6 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere probably actually between 5:30 and 6. Now, that being said, okay, they would have had a somewhat long day of work. So going to bed at about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, that seems pretty close to I would surmount to people just being tired. They're like, I need to go to bed, right? So of course the 2 youngest would have been in bed pretty early. I would assume Herman probably went straight to bed, and then Catherine and her 2 friends were probably getting ready for bed, probably a little bit of gossip or something like this before. All right. So this is the one thing we have to take a look at. So we know that the killers were already inside the home prior to the Moores' return home, since 2 cigarette butts were actually found in the attic. Now, it's one of those things that could both the parents have smoked? Sure. Now that's the thing we have to go and pay attention here. All right, there were 2 butts found in the attic. Would the parents have just gone to the attic, or would they have just gone outside? Would they have just smoked wherever in the house? During these times, cigarettes, it was pretty common. People just smoked. It's a thing, right? There wasn't a lot of regulation on it during the time, so smoking in the house would have been pretty common. Now, if this was a habit somebody was trying to break, which once again, it wasn't looked at, it wasn't really frowned upon as much. Maybe it stunk and things like this, sure, but it was kind of a common thing. So could this have been one of the parents or both the parents? Possibly, not likely though. And it's just for that reason. It wasn't really something that was really frowned upon. Right? So in the attic, not likely that Josiah or Sarah was smoking. If there could one of the children, possibly. But I mean, once again, it's coming down to why the attic, people would smell in the house. Right? Okay, now on top of that, now this is where it gets weird. Okay, so the killers were already in the house. They had to have been, right? Because they attacked in their sleep. Most people, when they go to bed, what do? They lock the doors, make sure the house is all locked up. Why? Because security. They want to feel safe. especially with so many people there. It makes absolute sense. Even back then, that would have made sense. Locking your doors middle of the night doesn't make a difference. Just locking your doors, right? All right. So we got that out of the way. So killers had to have been in the house. Now, once again, we got to look at how long it's going to take for people to fall asleep. They had a very, very hard, arduous day working, doing things, chores, things like this, playing, whatever, whatever kids do. It's going to take a little time still for the kids or all the people to really fully fall asleep. Okay, we're looking, I would argue it's going to take anywhere between 15 minutes and about 45 minutes for somebody just to fully fall asleep. When you go into that deep sleep, we're probably looking at about 30 minutes or so, right? And then, of course, once they hit that sleep, they're out. Most people there, it's a little bit harder generally to wake somebody up out of that. It's not impossible. Some people do, they aren't light sleepers, right? But the thing is, these killers were inside the house. So if somebody opened the door, it would have made noise, right? Now, these are older houses. They would have squeaked as somebody walked through the home, okay? There would have been some creaking, some squeaking of floorboards, things like that. So these people had to be quiet. All right, so now this has given us a couple other clues here. All right, so I would say somewhere between 12 o'clock in the morning and 5 a.m., the killers made their move. Now the thing is, they wouldn't, once these killings started, they couldn't stop. They had to go quickly because at the end of the day, you're hitting somebody with an axe, then you're killing people with these weapons. You're looking at, you have to do this quickly. Now, a lot of people like to believe there was one killer, and the video title, of course, Axeman of Villisca. After I got the title of this, I started looking at it a little bit more. So it should actually be titled Axemen. I don't think it was one killer. I think it was two at least. I do believe this was done very, very quickly. Right? As you guys can see from up here on the board, you can see this intricate kind of mess of people here. It's not super, super intricate. It's kind of a smaller kind of mess, but it all goes back to a few people here. All right? And there is one connection I did not include, which I want to talk about. I don't believe that was necessarily the connection to the murder, and I will get into that in a second. But I do believe there was at least two killers. And we do know that, like I said before, Mary Peckham checked on the family because of this unusual discovery that the family was not doing their chores around 7 o'clock in the morning, so wanted to check on them. Now, this is a woman that she was also kind of almost considered like a grandmother type of figure to these children, right? So she was rather close to them. She would have noticed some unusual habits pretty easily. Well, like I said before, Ross Moore was contacted. He checked on them, and he's the one who discovered the bodies. He sent Mary Peckham to go and contact the primary peace officer, which is basically like a law enforcement officer in Villisca. He was the primary, which means he's going to be the one who would have been basically in charge. He could have been really the only peace officer in Villisca, and that's what it does appear to be based on the reports. Now, keep in mind, the town population was like 1,250 or so. It wasn't very big. We're looking at a very, very small town. But that being said, Henry Horton, he goes by Hank, he arrived and he started collecting details. Now, this is very, very, we're looking at a small-time police officer that really didn't really have much going on. He was just kind of there, just to, keep the peace, if you will, but he probably would have been dealing mostly with like drunk and disorderly, maybe some brawls, something very, very small town-like, right? Not really dealing with homicide, maybe some minor theft. It's going to be basically slapping people on the wrist. Somebody's drunk and intoxicated in public. That's something he probably would have dealt with most commonly. So murder is not something that this town would have been rocked with very commonly, right? So his lack of professionalism, that's what I would call it here, his lack of know-how, potentially, it's pretty obvious here. This guy just really wasn't that great a police officer, or he knew what was going on, right? And it doesn't sound like that necessarily could have been the case, but it very well could have been. I mean, we don't know all the other details. That this is the part where it's kind of foggy. But we do know that he was contacted, he checked it out, he noted details on him. Just that's all he did, notated him. And then, of course, he opened the crime scene up to onlookers. And that was to go and collect further evidence, if you will. Things like picking up the axe that was found in the home. Right? Pick that up to go and test out certain theories about it. Okay, this guy, he's not able to go and hit the ceiling with this. He's not tall enough, so basically this isn't going to work here. Things like that. It was just little details here. He opened it up. That was the problem right there. So the axe, no matter what, they want to go and try and lift fingerprints off it at that point. They would have been there have been so many fingerprints on it, right? Now they only found one axe at the scene. So one might be asking, okay, well, why do you think there was two? Why do you think there was at least two killers? I will get to that. Not only is there the 2 cigarettes, now very well could have been one, but this would have been very, very quick, right? If you're smacking somebody in the head with an axe or hammer, something like this, which most of the kills were done with the blunt side of the axe, so we're looking at more like a hammer, like a bludgeoning, you're gonna have to be quick. Okay. Now I'm gonna get a little gruesome with this, as I want to go and explain this. And now this is a decent explanation of what it's kind of like. There used to be a comedian back in like the 1970s. I don't remember what his name was, but he was notorious for smashing watermelons with hammers, right? With different objects, but mostly with a hammer. He liked to smash watermelons. Thing is, now that's the thing here. Okay, we want to go and make this very clear, and I do have to paint this as kind of a gruesome thing here, but that's essentially kind of what it sounds like. Allegedly, what it sounds like. I don't know. I'm just saying, just from how it's been explained to me, that's essentially, and even from witnessing some videos like that, what it comes down to, that's what it's essentially like. It's like when you smash a watermelon with a hammer or a blunt object like that, it's that same type of sound, right? Not entirely, because there's other noises that smashing human head, I'm assuming, could also make, but that's, from what I've understood, is the most common type of comparison. But on top of that, it's also looking at it as in like the same type of mannerism, right? When you're smacking, something like that, it's just like going after a watermelon, basically. So we're looking at something very swift. You got to be like smack, and then just pull back, smack, 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 smack. You're just basically going to town, right? That's how this killer would have had to have went about this. Now, this is where we're going to start getting into who I believe the culprits are. As you guys can see up on the screen here, up on the board, this is the connection list I'm seeing. So, what we know about the crime scene is, like I said, it was very, very contaminated by onlookers. But we know that somebody had tried to clean off the axe, because they were able to find some water, some very bloodied water, in, I'm not sure if it was a glass or a pitch or whatnot, but they tried to go and clean it off. On top of that, there was also a slab of bacon. It was like 4 pounds of bacon or something like this, set right next to the axe. I'm not sure why. That's the part that's a little disturbing to me. I'm curious as to why there was bacon left next to it. To me, there's something off about that. But I do believe there is something there. I do believe that is more or less a red herring, if you will, trying to lure the police away. Why 4 pounds of bacon? I don't know. But it's, for whatever reason, I do believe this is why the killer had left it there. It's essentially to cross-contaminate, if you will, probably. Who knows? There's a number of things it could have been, but back then that seems still a little odd. But what we know about this little story here is, well, what drives a person to go and kill somebody? You got the usuals, like nowadays, especially in modern times, we have affairs, right? We have bad business dealings. We have business rivalries. We have whistleblowers. There's all sorts of different things. Well, back then, it wasn't common, but that was more kind of a practical reason, if you will. We got to see all this kind of stuff happen. It was bizarre. People would go and, it was things that almost made more sense. It's still not right, and I don't think it makes sense per se, but from a killer's perspective, I would think that's what it would kind of be looking at, is more or less there's a reason to go and basically get rid of somebody, right? As wrong as that is, it's one of those things that's like, okay, you can kind of understand the reasoning, kind of. Somebody's like, I need this guy out of my way, right? But here's the thing. I don't think it had anything to do with this, and the reason I say this is because we know we're going to get into political territory here, right? But we are going to be getting into the territory of there was an affair. Now, we know there was an affair because town operators were gossip fiends. They would constantly talk about who was talking to who and how long and with, what the conversations are about because they could hear it, right? But now here's the thing. So we had this lady, Donna, I think her name is Donna Bentley, something like this. She had moved in town about 4 years prior. And then 2 years after she had been there, she'd been a school teacher and all that, so she was hired to do there. She ended up marrying into the Jones family, which Frank Jones, which is the guy you can see on the board that she's connected to, that would have been her father-in-law. She married his son, Albert Jones, there's really not a whole lot known about the guy other than the fact that the guy was just essentially, like the way I've read from all these different articles about him, they use the term ineffectual. He doesn't seem like he was the sharpest tool in the shed, if you get what I'm saying. But he would leave out of town for different things like business and things like this. I'm not sure if it was delivering product, from his farm that he worked, or if it was delivering product from his father's shop that he was employed. But he would leave town somewhat often, it seemed like. And apparently Donna was quite flirty with at least 6 men in the town, with a couple that we know of. There was a man named Albert and then Josiah that both of these men she was having actual affairs with. She would invite them over and things like that. Now, one thing we need to understand about Josiah, what his connection is, it wasn't just, this is the daughter-in-law. No, this guy also had connections with Frank Jones here. Okay, and the big one was he used to work for him. And what ended up happening is he left that business and he started his own in direct competition with Frank. Now, allegedly, he had stolen a John Deere contract. That's what he claims it was claimed at least, that he had stolen this contract from Jones, which apparently angered Jones, and they apparently hated each other because they would even walk across the street from each other, which is kind of a huge sign of like hatred towards to each other in a small town. Allegedly, this is just what we're hearing from witness statements and people around town. They said that they did not like each other whatsoever. Okay, now this is where things get a little interesting here. So, like I said, I don't think it was the business dealings. I think that added to it, but I don't think that was the main cause for it, the main course, if you will, for this. Now, Albert had caught this other guy, Albert, who was having an affair with Donna, and the operators had heard gunshots, arguing all this. And then following day, you had this other Albert apparently he had a bandage on his thumb or something like this. So he had been injured, and he claimed it was for some other reason. But nothing. But the thing is shortly after all this, we got to see that the Moore family was murdered. All right. So what's more, okay, is Sarah was very, very big with the Presbyterian Church there. Very, very well liked among the community and all this. So you already got a few things here. Why was she killed? And we're going to get into some of the gruesome details here in a second. But we know that she was well liked, and she had invited this guy. He was a traveling reverend. Him and his wife were traveling most of the Midwest. I believe they had traveled all over the country, and they were basically just preaching the word of the Lord. Okay, cool. Well, she invited this guy, right? So he was just a visitor. He was just an invitee to this service. But he also had a bit of a perverted side, if you will. He was kind of a peeping Tom. He'd had several different accounts of this that had popped up. People had discovered all this stuff about this guy. Apparently, this guy had a bit of a checkered past here. And apparently, he would request that young women would also pose nude for him and things like that. Just really, really just peculiar things. So the guy was a bit of a pervert. All right. Well, Frank Jones, it is believed, the current theory, which I actually do believe. I looked at all these different theories, and this one actually makes sense. And we'll get into the second theory in a second, which involves Sarah's brother. But I think it was Sarah's brother. You know what, I'm gonna leave that for another time. But but we do know that, based on the theory, that Albert had really he had enough of this. He was not a fan of basically being cheated on, all these affairs and all this behind his back as he left town. So we believe that, because he didn't like Josiah either, that he's like, nah, we got to get rid of this guy. He's hurting us on the business front. He's hurting us on our, on the family front right now. Not okay. We got to get rid of him, right? Now, instead of, just going and talking to him and, handling things like, hey, knock this off, or, getting a divorce, things like this. There's a lot of different things that could have been handled, right? The mature, responsible way. Instead, this guy's like, no. We need to get rid of this guy. Well, he doesn't know what to do, and he's kind of fumbling this right now. So he talks to his dad. Now, we don't have any proof of this conversation here, so this is all speculation, right? But he talks to his dad. And his dad has got connections. He's a politician. So what's he start doing? Well, he talks to people, right? And it's to be assumed right now that he had hired William Mansfield, which is this guy on the bottom right, who is also suspected of other gruesome murders. Also, an axe was used on those as well. Similar fashion, we're talking covering, different, like the windows and things like this, making it so people can't see, doing things to make it so that way people couldn't hear what was going on either. Which we also found there's like aprons and things like this over the windows in the home. So this is where this gets a little eerie. So this guy's already got a connection to this, it looks like. And on top of that, we know his alibi was shot down. Apparently people had heard, this lady had heard three guys conspiring after the murder, or not after the murder, before the murder had occurred. And they were talking directly about this. She apparently thought nothing of it, just kind of like whatever, jerks or whatever, something like this, right? But it's three men. Now, this is where I also got a little weirded out by this. Okay, so you have a conspirator, at least one conspirator, saying, this is what I need you to do, and this is how I'm going to have you guys do it, right? And kind of just talking about how to do it. But there's three men, which means if there's only one that's missing, it means two of them would have to be the assailants here. At least. Or at best, I would say. So very well could have been Albert and Frank, but I would assume it was probably Frank talking to two people he'd hired. And I do believe that the Reverend George Kelly, which is this bottom left guy, he was a service attendee. I do believe he was involved as well. I'll explain why. But two men go in, they murder this entire people. But one of them has got defensive wounds on him, which is Lena Stillinger. She was 12 years old. She had defensive wounds on her. But on top of that, this is the really nasty part. Apparently, her nightgown had been pulled out. And it is believed that she had potentially been molested. Now, that's the really nasty part here, because all these other crimes we see, they had exact same MO, right? What did they have? They had coverings over everything. There was no molestation going on, but there was coverings over different areas and making it so that way sound was not available. On top of that, axe was used, and on top of that, Mansfield apparently already had his fingerprints in Fort Leavenworth's system, if you will. Obviously, computers weren't around back then, but they had that on file. So they had his fingerprints, so he would have had to have covered up. Well, here's the great thing about this that really brings it all in. All right, so we know we can't count on fingerprints for this. Well, and everything else is seeming to match like these other ones that all occurred during in the Midwest, which is Colorado, Illinois, and Kansas. But what's more is the fact that they didn't have fingerprints on those either. And Mansfield was the primary suspect on every single one of these. Allegedly got away from this. But it sounded more like he was like a hitman. But he also had a cocaine addiction. Right? So this guy was also, he was being looked at, I think it was 4 years after this. Two or 4 years after this he was actually suspected to have killed his baby, his wife, his mother-in-law, and there was like one other person, I believe. But he was suspected of that. And this guy, the investigator over here on the right, I don't want to remember what his last name is, like Wilkerson, I believe it was. He started looking at this case. And he's the one he's like, I think this guy's tied, and I think this is how, and I think this is all how it's gone. Now, he only thought Mansfield was the one who was doing it. I think it was Mansfield and George Kelly. And let me get why. You got a little pervert, Reverend George Kelly. I think this is where it differed, because there was a slight deviation here. And what do we have? We have potential molestation, basically the nightgown brought up and all this. So you have this potential perverted, it's not potentially, it's a perverted type of situation here with defensive wounds. It sounds like George Kelly, basically couldn't do what he wanted to do or whatever, so he basically went to town on her with the axe. Now, what's more is the amount of wounds. Apparently, Josiah